Hi everybody, Adam Steele from Hot Pole Studios here. You may have seen our basics tutorial of how to use Reaper from the very beginning. If you haven't, go and check that out if you're looking to use the very basics of a digital audio workstation. Today, we're going to expand on that a little bit and start to talk about the inbuilt effects that Reaper has, what they do, how to use them. So today, as always, I have my basic laptop in front of me, one of the old Lenovo ThinkPads. I've got my Audience Sono interface plugged in and ready to go. The scary studio computer behind me, which isn't really to do with what we're doing today. And I've loaded up a project which I recorded earlier this week. It's not finished and it's quite basic, which is quite helpful actually for what we're going to do today. And we've got some drums recorded and a few guitars. And as far as we're going to talk about today, that's it. Nice and simple. What we're going to do is look through what Reaper has in terms of its inbuilt effects, and we're going to try and use some of these in particular contexts so that you can actually see them being used where they're kind of supposed to be used. I've got a little list here in front of me because my memory is shocking. So the first thing we're going to do is play you back a little bit of what we have. Okay, so those guitars were recorded for use with testing out a video project that I had. And they are, in order, one set of drums, which is a stereo file. Let's also show the two rhythm guitars. And we also have the lead guitar. And later on, I recorded a little bit of vocal, just 1, 2, 3, ba ba da ba ba da ba da ba ba. And that's just something so that we can play around with it, get some compression and EQ and all that clever stuff going, without flagging up any copyright by using somebody's song that's already got all that kind of legal mumbo jumbo going on. So for today's purposes in this video, that's what we've got to work with. So let's see how far we can get. The first thing I'm going to talk about today is compression. Reaper has inbuilt compressors. It has two of them inbuilt. So we're going to start with talking about the most basic one, which is ReaComp. And then we're going to talk about the more clever one, which is ReaXComp. So let's look at the drums first for this, because these drums, they're one of those kind of like easy drummery type drum kits. I think it was actually the Stephen Slate drums that I used, but that's by the by. So this is just a nice, simple little loop. So let's bring up our mixer window, which I use the shortcut Control M there, but you can go to View Mixer. We're going to use the mixer quite a lot for effects. You can see them come up here. There's inserts and sends, as we briefly mentioned in the basics video. In the next video after this one, we're going to talk about really clever and complicated routing of inserts and sends and all that kind of stuff. But for now, we'll just kind of gloss over that and use the basics. In this case, we're going to use every effect for the next little while as an insert, just to make things simple. So, if we find where our effect button is on the drums and open that up, it gives us a list of every plugin that we have. And we want to find ReaComp, which is under VST, and then ReaComp. Double click that to bring it up. So, if we hit play, we can see those meters going, but the compressor isn't doing anything. If you're not particularly familiar with what compressors do, they tend to keep a sound that's kind of unruly and has these big spikes. They tend to keep it all kind of in one zone so that it's not going to get too loud at any particular point. That's the general idea of a compressor. There are some clever things you can do with compressors, but that's the basic idea. I'm not going to go too deep into what a compressor is or what an EQ is or anything like that in this video, that's probably the kind of thing you should look at another video for, and hopefully I'll do videos about that in another series. So, ReaComp, we can see when we hit play, this meter is moving. That's just the output level over here. Nothing is happening because nothing is going below our threshold. Even before we use the threshold, we need to turn the ratio on our compressor up to do something. So let's say 3:1, which means above this threshold, a 3:1 ratio means if you've got a jump of 3 dB, it'll be squashed down to 1 dB. So you'll still get some extra volume, but just not lots of extra volume. So like an 18:1 compressor, if you had an 18 dB spike, it would crush that down to just 1. And so on and so forth. That's kind of how that works. So without changing anything else, I'm going to hit play. And still nothing happens. So what we want to do now is hit play so we can hear it and gradually bring the threshold down until something happens. And now you can hear that really sounds quite squashed and squished. And we can see this red meter over here is showing us, as it dips, it's showing you how much compression is actually happening. If I do that again, you can see here the -6. So then we've got all these controls. So we can do things like, I personally like the release to be a smaller number, faster, which means instead of that kind of sound that you get after the compressor kicks in, it kind of lifts that a little. And I don't tend to go for specific numbers, I do tend to just use my intuition and use my ears there. For what I'm listening for is not having that thing. And then with the attack, I tend to like, especially on drums, having more attack, because that leaves that crack of the drum before everything gets controlled. So what I'll do here is I'll hit play and extend the attack out. So that sounds like a nice punchy controlled set of drums now. At the top here, there is a little tick box in the top right. Now that's a nice little shortcut to turn the entire plugin on and off. That's always there in Reaper on any plugin, whether it's one that comes with Reaper or a separate one. On this top bar, that tick box turns the whole thing off. So we can hear, because it's being compressed, it's kind of taking away some of the volume. That is very much what a compressor does. So then with the wet output, which is the amount of that signal that's being compressed, I'm going to turn it up a little bit and then try turning everything off and on again until they sound like they're roughly the same volume. And there we go. So as a result, the hits, the boom, da, boom, da, are roughly the same level that they were originally, but everything in between has kind of come up in level because we've pushed the volume, so that character comes out. To me, that sounds like a really good drum kit with lots of life in the sound now, just from using ReaComp. So let's move on. Let's turn that off with that little tick box, either on the name of the plugin or on the right hand side over here, like we said. And now we can double click in here and add ReaXComp. X for extreme. No, it's not for extreme at all. The XComp it's X because it's got a crossover. It is a multi-band compressor, which means that the bass is compressed separately, the low mid is compressed separately, the high mid and the top end can all be compressed or not compressed separately depending on your preferences, which means this is really clever. You can use this for several different applications. Either you can use this, if we go into the presets here, it's much quicker, I find, with something like ReaXComp to go into the preset list at the top and find something, because it's so infinitely configurable. It will take you all day to get through all the settings, so I tend to find a preset and then go from there because it saves me a lot of time. Let's go for mastering 3-band electro and hit play. Okay, so that's not doing very much to the signal, much like ReaComp wasn't doing anything until we brought those thresholds down. But we can see 1, 2, 3, and this one's a little bit more visual as well. So if I drag these down, you can see as I drag number 1 up and down, that's moving the threshold slider, which is just below it at the same time, because they represent the same thing, just in different ways. And so that threshold, if I bring that down, that's at a ratio of 1.23, so I'm going to bring that up to do something. And then I'm going to bring the gain up on that, just so that the actual level is roughly what it was before. Okay, and I can turn the active switch so it's on and off. And I can do something similar with all these bands. So if I turn the whole plugin on and off now with the overall gain the same, that's the kind of thing that you would quite often do in a mastering context, where you've got a mix that you're happy with and you're just trying to make everything sit separately, so the bass is smooth, the mids are smooth, the highs are not getting out of control but they're not kind of being compressed at the same time as everything else. I also sometimes find that on something like, say, a really aggressive pop vocal, this kind of thing can really work quite well. The last clever little trick that you can do here, let's move on to the little vocal bit that I did, which is rather silly, but should prove a point if I set selection to items and loop that. 1, 2, 3, ba ba da ba ba da ba da ba ba da ba da ba ba ba. 1, 2, 3, ba ba da. Yeah, so that t. We can use ReaXComp as a de-esser. Rather than having a separate de-esser plugin, all a de-esser really does in most circumstances, and there are other versions of de-essers, is it finds a particular frequency range, and when it's too high, it pulls it down. That's compression. But it's specific to a certain band, which makes it multi-band compression. So, if we pull up this preset, male DS, change band 2's frequencies for your singer, then band 1, I think, yeah, so it's almost no compression there. Band 3, which is above what we want, no compression at all there. And then band 2, which is roughly in the range of where S-ing is set to really, really compress. Really quickly bring that back up so that anything that's above a certain level, it just ducks that down. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You see, next to the number 2, whenever I actually say the number 2 in the loop there, it goes -8.7 because it's pulling that much out of that frequency. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And you can actually see on the FFT behind it, the scopes. If I just make this a little bigger, I could see that the T for 2 was happening a little higher up. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And then you play with your threshold until it's not killing the thing. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And you have a de-esser that you've not had to pay for, that you've not had to get externally extra from Reaper. It's right there as a preset in ReaXComp, so that might save you quite a lot of time. There you go. Nice little trick for you. Let's move back to something simple. Let's move to EQ. So Reaper's own EQ is ReaEQ. We mentioned this in the basics, so I'm not going to spend too long on this one. ReaEQ is really simple, but also really powerful. If I bring up ReaEQ on the drums, I can make this window bigger, and the whole thing will become bigger so we can see what's going on clearer. And it starts by default with 4 EQ points, but you can have as many as you like. So if I hit play, you can see on the screen how much low end there is, how much mid, how much high range. By default, band number 1, if we move that up and down, we can grab the number 1. That's a shelf, which means that it generally grabs everything below that point. And number 4 is a high shelf, so that grabs all the high end up beyond that point. So if I move where that is around, you can actually see graphically what that's doing, which is really quite nice. So we can make that. And so they're relatively simple as they stand by default. Bands 2 and 3 are bands exactly as described, which means you can see this kind of lump that one of them brings. I'm dragging it left and right to change the frequency that it's aiming at. And I'm simply dragging it up or down to add more or less. You can also use the sliders down at the bottom for frequency, gain, and bandwidth. Bandwidth is really important because if you want to play with the bandwidth, you can see on the screen, you can be really specific about a frequency, or a lot more general if you just want to have, say, more mids, but just a little bit, generally all the mids. You could have a really wide bandwidth, like lots of octaves like that, and just add just a little bit, say, and you might want to have a really wide bandwidth on an EQ point if you don't want to hear the specific frequency start to jump out, because that can happen quite a lot if you have too narrow a bandwidth, and that sounds like this if we have a really narrow bandwidth. Could you hear that kind of noise there? That's what happens when an EQ is too specific and there's too much. You might want to use that as an effect. Cool. But a lot of the time, even when it's not that extreme, if you tend to use too much EQ that's too narrow, you can hear it very often. So just be careful with that, because if you use loads of one particular frequency, it can be quite dangerous because you hear that and it sounds unnatural. Whereas what you might need is just a bit less, but a bit broader, so that you're adding a little bit of the frequencies around it, so there's less of that ringing noise. Another thing that I tend to use a really specific EQ for is maybe, like, let's say the snare has an awful note in it, it's going dong dong. What I can do is get a really narrow EQ and find that note just by sweeping it around really loud. Could you hear when I'm playing that? The snare's now going dong, 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 dong. So what I can do now is take the gain back to normal, back to 0, and then go below, and that will start to remove that note completely. In this case, the drums are recorded particularly well, but if you've got an example of, say, a tom that was out of tune, had a particular extra note in or something like that, you can start to remove little bits. Or if you've got an electric guitar that's got a really harsh kind of tone, let's use that example actually. Let's just use one of these rhythm guitars and just solo it. This is something that I see done a lot in professional production actually, is that if you've got lots of really heavy guitars going on in a mix, you might find there's a certain frequency that's really quite nasty in there and it's quite painful to the ears. So what you can do is try and isolate it so it's even more painful and then just go, no, we don't want that, and just remove some of it. Let's try that now, and you might want to cover your ears. Apologies in advance. So it's quite subtle on its own, but in a mix it can make a huge difference. When I disable this, the electric guitar still sounds good, but it's got a kind of a in that high range. As soon as I enable that EQ dip, that nastiness has gone. That's the kind of thing that can be used for very powerfully. Other things that you can do briefly that it's good to talk about while I'm on electric guitar is where, if I go to band number 1 and it said low shelf, if I change that type, we can use high pass, which kills everything below a certain frequency. And that's really useful on heavy guitars because that can scoop out the ultra low end, which would fight with the kick drum and the bass. And then if I move that as we're playing, you'll really hear what that does. There we go. So you can hear it almost makes kind of a radio effect as you go up. But then what I really wanted was just to get rid of the super low rumble. Because I still want kind of a brutal guitar sound there, but I don't want that going on that's just interfering with everything else. You can also change the high shelf to be a low pass, which only lets things pass that are low. By default, this will sound quite muddy now. But by bringing that back up, I brought that up to about 13 kilohertz. Anything that was above that, that was super fizzy, that was just getting in the way of the mix, is now gone. And you can find that you can make guitars, particularly, really fit in a mix quite well by using high pass and low pass filters at the right places. Don't overdo it. And that can really help heavy stuff fit well. Not just heavy, it also works in pop really well. It works in all sorts of genres, really. Especially when you've got loads of instrumentation going, you might want certain synths, for instance. You might want to remove some low end or some ultra high end to leave space for things like vocals or kick drums or whatever it is that you've got that you want to be the main focus in those frequency ranges. That's a very easy, very CPU efficient way to do it. Let's go back to the solo guitar and quickly talk about ReaDelay. Because ReaDelay, without ReaDelay, this guitar solo sounds very dry. So I'm going to turn on ReaDelay now, and the first thing that will happen is it'll sound really quite messy because it'll just be a straight 4-beat delay. So that's really quite kind of confusing and everything, but by default, all ReaDelay is doing is taking that signal and playing it again 4 beats later. Now you can get really clever with this. If I take length musical and just reduce that back to 0 and add length time, I can then measure this in milliseconds rather than in beats, which is quite often my personal preference unless I'm working specifically to a tempo. Okay, so for a second I'm going to just take away the dry signal, which is the original guitar signal, just so we can hear what's going to happen here. Because it can get quite dizzying on its own, really. So as we play that, if we turn up some feedback here, that will take the same delay and repeat it through a bit quieter, bit quieter, bit quieter. Based on the feedback, if it's at 0 dB, it would be exactly the same over and over and over. It would be like a loop pedal. So you can actually use that as a very crude loop pedal if you really want. And then there's a high pass and low pass filter like we were just talking about with EQ. You can use those in here. And that's something that I find is quite useful on a delay because it takes away a lot of the high end and super low end that would interfere with a signal when you're trying to use a delay. There's resolution, which I tend not to mess with, but you can if you want like lo-fi delay, and stereo width if you want to kind of mono it or have the left and right of a stereo signal be delayed kind of backwards, which is cool. And then so if I hit play on that, that sounds more like you would imagine a delay pedal to sound. So if I bring the dry signal back in, which is the actual signal, and maybe bring the wet, which is the amount of delay that we've got, down a bit. Cool. So that's now a delay, and if we add a tap, this is where you can have as many of these delays as you like. So what I'm going to do is I've got exactly the same thing going twice. The second one I'm going to make nearly twice as long, and I'm going to use this volume and pan here and have one on the left and one on the right. It's one of my favourite things to do with a ping pong delay, is have one that side, one that side. So now if I hit play, I've now got myself a nice ping pong delay because one's twice as long as the other. And that's really kind of nice in terms of getting big stereo delay sounds. Again, without paying anything extra for any separate delay plugins or pedals or anything. There you go. At this point, I'm just going to give a very quick shout out to some of the slightly more niche plugins that are built into Reaper that I don't tend to use on a daily basis, but that are here and are really quite clever. So there's ReaCast, so if you're using Shoutcast, so if you're doing like a live digital radio broadcast, you can actually do that direct from Reaper, which is crazy. That's really impressive. You can just put all your details in here, just hit go, broadcast, and you're off. There's reinsert, which I'm going to talk about much more when we get to talking about routing in the next part of the series, which is a really clever and cool thing, but today is a little bit beyond what we're talking about. There's ReNinjam, so if you're using Ninjam, which is a really clever little online collaboration tool where I think you get like 4 bars that you play and then your friend on the other side of the internet gets 4 bars and you get to kind of jam. That's all there, and I think that's really kind of cool. There's Restream, which I've used before when I was doing the original set of Reaper tutorials, because what this can do is this can send the sound from any track in Reaper, including the master track, through to any other copy of this Restream plugin, which you think, oh, well, why is that a big deal? But you can use the Restream plugin with any other DAW. You can use Restream with anything that will use VSTs anywhere on your network. So you could send your audio in real time to another computer on the network that's using Logic or Pro Tools, anything that can load Restream somehow, because you can get these plugins, by the way, as a separate free download from the Reaper website. Not to use with Reaper. If you want to use these plugins with something else like Cubase, you can just do that. I think that's amazing. But what I would do is I would broadcast this using the local broadcast on the same computer, and you use the word identifier. You just call it a name so you can send different things. And I would have one channel that was my voiceover microphone being broadcast to the live stream software, and another channel that was the mix, so that I could then have them separate. And that was so powerful for me. There's ReaVocode, which is clever. So if you send it one signal and another signal, it can use them together as a vocoder, which is something that's like from the 60s and 70s, real classic experimental synth stuff. And there it is, just in a plugin for you, nice and easy. There's ReaVoice, which I've not really used, but apparently it's a multi-voice pitch shifter. We're going to talk about pitch shifting in a minute, but you can kind of play it like a keyboard. That's really kind of cool. There's ReaSynth, which we talked about briefly in the previous episode, which is kind of a synth generator, which is really kind of clever. And there's ReaSampleomatic, which I might come back to and talk about another time, but you can load samples in here, and you can either trigger them like a drum where it doesn't change the pitch, or you can actually trigger them like an old school sampler. You can do all sorts of sound manipulation in here, and then stack it with other drums, so you can have make a full drum kit out of Sampleomatics. And it means that getting samples and playing them with a MIDI keyboard, that kind of thing, suddenly becomes really easy, and you don't have to go out and buy like an Akai MPC sampler or anything like that. If you've got a MIDI keyboard of any kind and this, it won't take you long to just do that. I mean, you can even, if I click on a sample and go import item from a range, it just puts that sample in here. That saves you so much time. You could load each separate drum up into Reaper, click them, and then click that button. I mean, this is a bit ridiculous having a 91 second long guitar solo as a sample, but if I wanted to and do things with it, it's all there. A plugin that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that can be really quite powerful for you is ReaFir, which is to do with FFT, fast Fourier transforms, and it's really quite clever. You can use this in a few different ways. It's got an EQ style which you can use, which is very cool. So you can do that with it. You can make it an EQ. You can change its mode to be a gate, but not a gate like that opens and closes for everything, but a gate that specifically just lets certain frequencies through that you pick. I mean, I'm not sure what I would use that for, but the fact that you can do frequency-specific gating is really quite clever. If I reset it, you can do compression, but not like ReaComp and ReaXComp. You can just drag in specific points. You can use it so that you can go at this particular frequency. If it gets above this at any point, just bring it down, which is head bending. There's convolving left and right, which again is a little beyond me, but one that I really like is the subtract mode. And this is something I've seen Glenn Fricker from Spectre Sound Studios use a few times as a noise filter. This is something that's really quite clever. What you can do, let's just see if I've got a longer sample. I've got a tiny little bit at the end of this guitar solo. I'll just close that for a second, where I can see that it plays and then it's got some kind of hissing noise at the end. If I take the plugin off for a second. And you hear that hissing noise, that what we can do with ReaFir, and this is something that's really good if you're recording a vocal like this in a noisy environment. It's really quiet in here, so I don't tend to do noise reduction. But if I'm out at a broadcast or something, I could use this, and if I hit automatically build noise profile and just play the noise through it, you can see at the bottom here, if I now untick that so it doesn't add anything to it, a very specific noise floor. And the idea now is not that this is a gate, but now if I play the solo through this, at any point that background noise will be removed all the time. And that's naturally then cutting out that noise all the time. So even if you had some like horrible whining noise, as long as it was consistent and constant, this would do that job for you. And I think that's really quite impressive to have as a free tool. Free noise reduction. You might have to use, up where I said there was the tick box at the top that turns it on and off, right next to it is a little slider that changes how much effect is going and how much of the original signal is. That's the wet control. So 100% wet is everything that this plugin is doing, and 0% is you're not even using the plugin and the original's coming straight through. 50% is half and half, and so on. So you could balance the original signal and just take the noise down a little whilst leaving it sounding quite natural, depending on just how bad the noise was. Let's just play this bit at the end here. I can almost completely eliminate that background noise now using the FIR, which is using 0.4% of my processor on this basic old laptop. That's so efficient. I could use that on every channel and it wouldn't overload the thing. That's really clever. Next up, something that we did mention in the previous episode, which was ReaVerbate, which was the Reverb plugin. So I'm going to just play this guitar from a little further back. So the only controls that you get here are how big the room is, how much that high end is damped, the stereo width. If there's a little bit of a delay, which I like to use a little bit before the actual reverb comes in, because that makes it sound more realistic to me. And then there's low pass and high pass so that you don't get any muddiness from the actual reverb. And that can be really quite useful. It can also be quite limiting. If that's exactly what you need, then great. If it's not, then that's when we switch to using Reverb, which is a lot more powerful, but can need some extra help. So Reverb, if we put 100% wet, Reverb runs on impulse responses, which is something that I could talk about all day. Impulse responses can be used for a great number of things, but you can either generate one yourself here, or you can load in a file and then play with it, and that's what I tend to do. The first thing I can do here is in this big blank space where it says impulse response generation, I can add something. So I can add a reverb or an echo generator, and that will make something in here, and that'll just make, you see there's a bit of a gap and then there's all this sound. If I add that in with the dry signal, that's being generated in real time by this generator. If I remove that and add the echo generator, that looks a lot more simple. Doesn't sound quite so nice, but I'm sure there are applications there. What I like to do here is I like to add a file. Now, at this point, you can get impulse response wave files from loads of different places. The place that I use to get, where is it? For this, I'm going to load in Simplicity's Bricasti M7, and I'm going to find, I don't know. There's a big list of them here, so I'm going to go for Bright Plate, and then Bright Plate mono to stereo, and that looks like this. And that needs to come down in volume, so the first thing that I need to do where it says normal is apply minus 18 dB gain. Because that'll suddenly make this a reasonable volume level, because quite often impulse response files come in and they're really loud and make everything really loud. So if I add that in with the dry now, cool, and that file is a capture of a Bricasti M7 really nice expensive reverb unit that's been condensed into a file. So I'll leave a link in the description to Simplicity's M7 impulse response library. It is free, but it's also donationware, so if you do end up using this stuff, then do donate to their cause, because they make some really good reverb stuff right here. And you just download the one you need, which for us was WAV files, 32-bit. In my case, 44.1 kHz. If you're working in 48, then 48. There are different options as well for if you're using a different impulse response loader, which we might talk about in the external plugins module, but today we're going to talk specifically about Reverb's own inbuilt stuff, because this is really clever. So after this file, coming back to Reverb, I can now add a filter after that, which will then, if I want, take some of the high end and the low end away from the reverb, which is something I like to do quite a lot, because I find that ultra high end and ultra low end in reverbs can get quite muddy and messy with the rest of your mix. Nice. And there's also trim, gain, and stretch. So what you can do, and what I quite often do, is change the maximum length to be shorter. So what this will do now is, instead of the reverb going on and on and on and on, it'll just kind of end at a certain point. Which means that you still get that nice reverb sound, that tone of that reverb, but it doesn't go on too long. It's quite a useful kind of thing there. Another thing that's briefly worth mentioning is that this and some of the other Reaper plugins can make for a huge delay. If you try and record this live with the monitoring like we talked about in the basics, it will go with a real long gap. And that is at the bottom here where you see the 16,000 samples. That's the delay. That's huge. What you can do at the bottom right where it says performance in this plugin, you can change the max FFT. Basically, the higher the number there, the better the quality is. But also, there's a tick box for LL, which is low latency. And there's ZL, which is zero latency. If I click zero latency, I might now have to turn this plugin off and on. Or maybe offline. And then bring it online again. Yes, there we go, because that then reset the plugin. So now the delay is 0 and 0 samples, but the amount of processor usage has jumped up. So it's a trade. If you use the 0 latency box there, that means you can then track with that live and it won't cause huge delays, but at the same time, the amount of processor usage goes up. If you've got processor usage to spare and that's what you need it to do, by all means tick that box. But if you're just mixing, then the computer will take care of that delay and shift everything so that you don't hear any delay, so that everything works properly, and the amount of processor usage will be a lot lower. So yeah, don't tick that box unless you need it, but it's good to have it there if that's what you're doing with it, which I quite often track singers and that kind of circumstance with 0 latency to get a real-time reverb. I mean, this is a really loud reverb. It's more than I would send to a singer, but I'm just trying to demonstrate things as obviously as possible to you here. I'm going to use reverb one more time here in a completely different setup, and that is, if I look down here, something that I've not shown you yet today is that I have these rhythm guitars as recorded as just the guitar amp with no speaker cabinet, which is something you can do if you capture things just right, and it sounds horrible. It sounds like a box of bees. what you can do with that, and quite often I'll do something like using this 2 Notes Le Crunch preamp pedal or the Le Lead, or using a real, something like a PV amp or something like that with a 2 Notes captor load box. The sound you get off that will sound like that. It will sound really bright. And what you can do then is you can load up an impulse response. And we've just been using impulse responses for reverb. You can also use impulse responses using reverb. If we completely take out the dry signal here, we can add a file of an impulse response of a guitar cabinet. So if I go up a few, and I've got this big list of the Celestion Plus impulse responses which I've bought, but there are free ones out there, which I'll link to. I think it's God's Cab in the description, which is a free Mesa oversized 4x12 set of impulses that you can get. I'm going to use a Celestion Vintage 30 and a 4x12. And I'm going to spare you the details here because I've already done a detailed video on this. But I'm going to use an SM57 balanced. And without using the dry signal, just using the wet signal through this should sound now reasonable. So this is it without. And this is it with. And because I'm not using the zero latency here, I'm using 0.2% of the processor usage, again on this basic old laptop, to make it sound like it's coming through a real screaming 4x12 cabinet. Which, if you're recording in silence, is exactly the kind of thing you probably wanted to use Reaper for in the first place. Because if you're recording at home, you probably want these kind of features where you can have your real analog gear, and it might take an extra bit of equipment. Like if you're using a tube amp, using something like one of these, which is a load box, a torpedo captor from 2 Notes, plug it into that, then use the output into your interface, you get that horrible buzzy sound, but you load in an impulse response. If you're tracking this live, you'd use that zero latency tick box like I was saying, and you'd be able to hear that in headphones or whatever, sounding about as good as it's going to get without the actual speaker blasting people. And so that's all inbuilt into Reaper, and that's it. You've got everything at your fingertips. And we've not even talked about the JS plugins, which there are hundreds of, which can do all sorts of weird and wonderful things. And I encourage you to just go in and find those and play with them and just click on them and go, oh, what does this do? Click and just experiment, because there's so much in there that without you having to look elsewhere, you can really have a great time finding everything that you need in there. Like there are something like 8 different types of delay, or even more than that. There are loads of different types of compressors and gates, and I didn't even talk about gates and sidechaining and that kind of thing. I might leave that, I'll talk about the gate plugin, ReaGate, which is inbuilt, in the next module, which is about routing, because gates and routing can be intertwined. They can be so linked that it's something I'm going to talk about in the next module. So this is probably a good place to leave this one. And yes, stick around, guys. Thank you for watching, because the next one is going to be really deep. We're talking about how to send a sound to another channel and all the crazy things that's for and what that can do for you. Thanks for watching. Thank you to all the patrons on Patreon for helping us out, because that really, really helps us to keep doing these kind of things. And we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching. See you soon.
Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this, feel free to check out our other videos, as you can find here, or check out our Facebook and Twitter, or our Patreon page, which helps us to make more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.